Right. And this is exactly why I wanted to start the book with those 4 near-death moments, because those stories just get airbrushed out. And there's a good reason for that, I think. Like people, when journalists or podcasters ask founders to tell the story, what you really want is a crisp soundbite. And the reality is never crisp. It's always complicated, and it's often not flattering.
The New Zealand Tech Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, proactive and strategic IT.
Hey folks, greetings and welcome along to the New Zealand Tech Podcast. Great to have you with us today. And look, a real privilege to have Rowan Simpson, who's the chairman at Hoku Group and the author of How to Be Wrong. Welcome to the show. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Before we get into your story and too much about the book, How to Be Wrong, how did you come up with that title?
Yeah, okay, so here's what you need to understand about how to be wrong. There's only 3 ways to be wrong. The first way is to not even ask the question. So never measure, never ask whether it's working or not.
Yeah.
The second way to be wrong is to just make an error. We're all human. We have biases. Just, you need to be aware that you might be making a mistake. And then the third way is just to lie, to know that you're wrong or that it's not working, but to pretend otherwise, which is kind of surprisingly common in startups.
Yeah, okay.
So yeah, I kind of settled on that title because all of those 3 things are easily avoided.
Yes, yeah.
And then you give your chance to be right. So that's
Love
what it's
it.
all about.
Love it. That's great. Well, thanks for joining us today. Also, a big thank you to our show partners, to 1NZ, Spark, 2 Degrees, HP, and Gorilla Technology. Today, look, it's a great chance to hear some of your journey, a bit of a taste of what's in the book. And, really, what are the lessons and takeaways that we can learn from, some of the successful companies that you've been involved in, the likes of TradeMe, Xero, Vend, Timely, some incredible stories there. And, of course, TradeMe, it's still, I think, an incredible story. We probably haven't really delved into a lot of detail on it because Sam doesn't tend to do too many interviews, and it's just one of those things that hasn't come up. So I'm looking forward to hearing a little bit about TradeMe and that what was it, $750 million sale and that story. But before we delve into that, maybe a little bit about Hoku Group in terms of, I guess, what you're doing right now.
Right.
And then we'll flip back to the history.
You mentioned 4 amazing companies that I've had the opportunity to work on, and each of those by themselves has been a remarkable outcome and successful business and big exit. So Hoku Group is really just our family office, which is not a description that you hear very often in New Zealand. Overseas, it's a bit more common, but the way to think about it is it's a private fund. So it's our own money that we're managing and investing, and obviously there's lots of parts to that, but our legacy is in startups, and we still do that. So I still spend a lot of time, working directly with founders like I always have done, trying to help them get started, grow their businesses and go from there. So Hoku Group is the umbrella that sits across all of the things that we do.
Great. Well, let's hear a bit about your story. Where did you grow up? What's your founding story?
Yeah, sure. I was born and bred in Wellington, which was where both TradeMe and Xero had their origins. They were both anchored in Wellington,
yes.
which is an important part of the history. We can maybe talk about that. But went to school at Rongotai College, went to university at Victoria, studied computer science. So my route into the startup world was as an engineer. I am still someone who likes building things and making software and solving problems. And so I was a consultant for a while and then did my own startup. So
right.
I did a company called flathunt.co.nz.
Yes. Yeah. Well, keen to get to that. But back to those sort of younger years, where did your sort of technology and engineering interest begin? What do you think triggered that and led you down that track to study it and that really put you in this world?
Oh, look, I've always been the sort of person who's just curious about how things work. My mum would tell you that even when I was little, I used to drive them crazy by, taking apart electronics or, I guess being annoyingly curious like little people can be. And so, I was never really content just being a consumer of the technology that we had. We had like an Atari 2600. I write about that in the book a little, and it's fun to play Pac-Man, but for my interest at least, it was kind of more curious to say, okay, we've got these little cartridges and we just push them in and all of a sudden these magical things appear on the screen, but how does that actually work? And yeah, I think the key is the curiosity. And I've sort of always had that, and hopefully I always have that. And I try to encourage that in everybody. Like,
that's great, and it's a good reminder, to us to look at these things which sometimes you don't recognise what a particular trait in a family member, a youngster, yourself, could mean or could lead to if you encourage or you end up leaning into that, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's easier to stamp that sort of stuff out probably if you're not doing that consciously.
Don't break that thing. Don't touch it.
Right. I mean, it's not a good day when you come home and find your VCR spread all across the floor, I imagine. So
is that something that you've done?
That's something that I might have done. Yeah. Yeah, I learned a little bit about how videotape works, so why not?
Yeah, and some probably some other lessons too that come in there when you're dealing with other people's property.
Yeah, right. And I mean, if you think about this, I mean, I'm now a parent. Thinking about how you apply that to your own kids, it's like don't just settle for the because answer. Like if you don't know the answer, why don't you be curious and find out yourself, and then you can both learn.
Yeah. That's cool. And so getting into your time at Victoria University, how did you decide what to lean into and what to focus on? Was that a very natural
it wasn't really. No, I had no idea what to study. I was actually the first person in my entire extended family who had gone to university, so I didn't really have a good frame for that. And so I kind of went wide and shallow to start with, but pretty quickly found the things that I was good at and the things that I felt like I could lean into and really, do well at. And so, yeah, I think, it felt like a natural transition to go down that route.
Yeah.
I wasn't someone who had like a deep grounding in software engineering or even computing, really. I tinkered on my own time. But, one of the interesting things about computer science in those days, I assume it's still true, is that, the courses start off with a lot of people. You start off in a huge big lecture theatre, but pretty quickly it gets winnowed down to a few people. And so, yeah, I was one of those who was able to stick with it as it got more complicated.
Yeah, great. And so through that period at university, who did you connect with? Who did you meet? And, how is that part of your story there?
I mean, that was the period of time where I met my wife, so that was a really important moment for me personally.
Yeah.
I actually met Sam going back a little further. So Sam and I were in the same class together.
Sam Morgan of Trade Me.
Rongotai College. So and actually Nigel, who was one of the third of the four original Trade Me folks, was also he was a year or two ahead of us at school, but from the same school. So we kind of had some things in common.
Right. So that was there before
younger.
university.
Yeah.
And so walk us through sort of moving into the working world and how these dots joined up.
So I mean, my startup journey, if you like that word, it would start with Flat Hunt, which was my attempt, I guess, my response to the .com bubble. So this was late 1999. Everybody thought they could start a .com business. I was no exception, and I learned a lot of lessons pretty quickly about what I could do well and what I couldn't do well in that sense. So after about 6 months of working on that, I'd got it to a steady state, but it wasn't really paying me a salary. So I needed to start doing some proper work.
Yes.
Some paid work at least. And one of those was Trade Me. Sam had just raised $100,000 from his, what we would now call a seed round. Those investors got 50% of the company, by the way, which was a pretty good deal for them.
Wow. So this was sort of a family and friends type thing?
It was actually some former colleagues of his who had recently spun out on their own. And so those guys are what we now call Movac in New Zealand. They've subsequently gone on to start that venture fund.
Yes.
So Phil McCaw and Richard Abbott and those guys were the original investors in Trade Me. But so Sam had a small amount of money and he needed a software engineer and I managed to be that guy. He'd recently, just before me, hired his sister Jessie, who was employee number one, and I was the first employee that didn't have the surname Morgan, and we went from there.
Yeah. And so when you look back on that time as a very small entity at the very beginning stages, what are the lessons and the things that kind of stand out that you look back on of things that either were done really, really poorly, but hey, you got through, all the things that were done exceptionally well that are great lessons too? Yeah,
so probably the biggest lesson from Trade Me for me was the realization in some ways, quite hard realization that what you can build is not sufficient. So the original business model for Trade Me was free. It was free to sell, free to buy, and we assumed that we could sell ads around that to support the business. And we went hard at that, and we gave that our best shot. And I start the book with the stories of the near-death moments of all 4 of these great companies that I've had the opportunity to work on. And that was Trade Me's near-death moment. We got to the point where we'd spent all the money. The shareholders who had money were lending money to prop the company up.
Yes.
I had no money to prop the company up with. So I was, I reduced my rates as much as I could to try and keep it alive. But that ultimately failed. Like, of the 4 of us who were the original team, 3 of us left. I left, I went to the UK. Sam and Jess were also in London at the same time as me. And it was sort of a, last one out, turn off the lights situation, really. I think if I'm honest, reflecting on that, when I left, I wasn't certain that there'd be a Trade Me to come back to. But just in time, as it turned out, we realized that it's not just building a product that people love, it's building a product that people love and will pay for. And, turning on success fees, which retrospectively, let's pretend that was strategic genius from all of us, but really it was just we were starting to run out of alternative options to try and generate some revenue. And so, that's the biggest lesson. Like, a lot of founders like to describe themselves as working on technology companies, and they get very focused on what they can build and how complex that is. But really, you need to start with the customer and work backwards to what they might value. And then the technology is not the most interesting part of the story.
You wouldn't be able to do it without the technology, but
100%, it's an enabler.
All of the other pieces are
it's a prerequisite, but it's not sufficient. Yeah.
And it's interesting, isn't it, that you stumbled upon the success fees. That's probably a somewhat common reality, isn't it? That you have challenges and you're just always looking to solve the problems and to knock those issues off.
But part of that is just being aware and looking around, having your head up, because eBay at that stage was maybe a year or 18 months ahead of us. Like, they were tiny. They had, a million members or something like that as a global business. But they had a business model that was showing some early signs of momentum. And so just being aware of that and thinking, how could we apply that to the problems that we've got was part of the key to unlock the ultimate success.
Very good, very good. And from there, you went overseas.
Yeah, so I came back to Trade Me after about 3 years, and by then the company was slightly different configuration. By that stage, we were in the high growth period of that business, so it was a very different experience. It's kind of holding on to the tail of the tiger and trying to. And
you were a shareholder at that.
I mean, I sort of skipped over that, but so Trade Me. The way I eventually got sucked into Trade Me is they acquired Flat Hunt from me, and all I got was Trade Me shares. So that turned out to be a decent trade in the end. Yeah, and so right through to the sale, I was part of that team, the product team and the engineering team, and as I say, trying to keep up with it all. It was those were the good old days, Paul. They were in some ways the hardest work that probably we'll ever do, but the most satisfying and rewarding thing to build a small team like that achieves so much.
Now, you talk about hardest work, and I think there are times we sort of look back on, sometimes it's when we're younger or we're in certain, stages of business where we work really hard. What did that look like at that time for you and some of the other team members when things were going really nuts and it was really high growth?
Yeah, I mean, I try not to pay too much attention to people who kind of labour the fact that they're working hard, because that's also insufficient. There are plenty of people who work hard on a startup and it's not successful.
Yeah.
But I mean, like the amazing thing about Trade Me in those days was really the people that we were building. So probably the most interesting single data point in the book is there were 53 of us at the point we sold that business for $750 million. So that's a pretty small team by modern standards. And there was no room for passengers in that team. We hired really carefully. We were all young, diverse on other dimensions, but definitely not on age. And we became, I guess, really hyper-focused on that. So I have this idea of the unbounded commitment, like when you're all in on something that's really going well, it kind of just soaks up all that you have to give it. And that was definitely what it felt like to me. in that later stage of TradeMe. It was all encompassing and delightful.
And how did you kind of keep your broader life in some sort of sense of balance when things are that full on?
It's difficult. So our youngest was born just when I came back from the UK. Right. So also trying to juggle parenting there, and that was true for a few of us too. Yeah. You know, we were kind of that age. So yeah, that's quite grounding to have to go home at night and be a dad. It quickly knocks you off any sense of invincibility that you have. So,
and I guess the process of TradeMe getting sold, you know, what was your involvement there, and how did that feel to be, you know, ultimately these handing over the ownership and so on, and then how did you ultimately exit out? How did that?
Yeah, so I was in a slightly unique position in that Sam and I were the only shareholders who were also employees by that stage. So Nigel had left the company. He was still the second biggest shareholder, and those other early investors, you know, some of them were directors, but they didn't have a day-to-day role like Sam and I did. So yeah, I mean, it was kind of, I guess I had a slight inside view of that transaction as it emerged. For me personally, it's easy to kind of pin that as the life-changing moment, but the way I like to describe that and the way I describe it in the book is really that was just the day that everybody else realized how successful TradeMe was. Because like we knew that for a while, even when I first came back, we were already getting pretty good dividends out of the business. You know, it was a very strong cash generating business. And so, you know, our lives had already kind of changed really in advance of the day that it was announced to everybody else. But yeah, I mean, like there was a lot of commentary at the time, I guess, too, around, you know, how is it possibly worth that much? It's a big number. But really it was just valued, you know, on a multiple of what it was earning and what it could earn in the future. And, you know, history would judge that price to have been about right. So yeah, it was a function of what we'd built.
And I mean, it's always an interesting thing to me, how you value, you know, an entity. What did that sort of side of it look like from your perspective, and the process around coming to arrangement? And you said, you know, look, the value was about right, and I think, you know, some years later it's sold.
You only know that in hindsight, though,
you
right?
know.
So I mean, when I work with founders, the question of valuation, even today, is still often really front of mind for people, especially when they're trying to raise money. They have to kind of put a line in the sand. And the way I like to think about that is, you know, the day after you raise money, your company's once again worth nothing. So that's the right mindset, I think, to have. Like if you start
break that down, what do you mean it's worth nothing?
Well, if you start to think, you know, someone paid, you know, a high value for a small portion of the business, and you extrapolate that across the whole business, it's very easy to mislead yourself about what you've created.
Gotcha.
Like the value's realized when someone else will pay you for it. And so it's really easy to kind of go down the rabbit hole on that and think that that's the important thing. But the important thing is the value that you're building for customers. If you focus on that, and that's, you know, this is the TradeMe lesson, I guess. You know, we were hyper-focused on creating an amazing experience for everyone who sold and bought on the site. That generated a lot of cash, and that underpinned a great valuation. And, you know, that's the thing that people actually working on these businesses can influence, and getting too distracted by the valuation can be really misleading.
Yeah, great point. Yep. Now, just out of curiosity, when you look at TradeMe now, yeah, how does that make you feel? How they operate and how they're running, and their alignment with, you know, what the original, you know, focus was.
Yeah, I mean, it's a long time ago now, Paul, that we sold the business. Yeah. So like there is a period of time in my experience, I've been lucky enough to experience a few times, where you still have an affinity to the business, but it does fade over time. You know, other people pick it up and take it in their own direction. And so, you know, I have to give credit to the people who have done that over many years since I worked there. You know, the fact that it's still a strong business and still, you know, an important part of the New Zealand landscape, really. I guess there's a small sense of pride in that. We built something that has lasted and proven this, you know, over a long time, that it's got some longevity, but that's a constant challenge. You know, they operate now in a totally different environment to the one that we were in. Yeah. Facebook hadn't even been invented when we sold TradeMe, which is kind of a bit of a, you know, a mind melter. So
Yeah,
So
I think
yeah,
it was
you know,
MySpace had a sort of sale within a similar.
MySpace was actually a
time
company
frame.
that we referenced a little bit because they also used .NET, if you allow me to get a little bit geeky here for a moment. Like that's the software architecture that we built TradeMe on at that point. And yeah, there weren't too many other sites of equivalent scale around the world using that sort of architecture at that stage. So we paid a little attention to what they were doing.
And I think their figure, it was $750 in USD or something like it. I have a recollection that it was like, oh, that's pretty incredible considering their sort of notoriety and so on at the time. Now, of course, all that turned to,
of course, yeah. The one I remember is Hotmail. You remember Hotmail was actually a standalone service, and that was acquired by Microsoft. And I think that was 400 million US.
Right. So
and we sort of saw that at the time and did the numbers and thought, actually, what we've got is kind of better than that. And I remember it really clearly because it was one of those moments where it's like, actually, there's a huge amount of value being created here.
Yeah. That's interesting. So, what happened from there? Were you around for?
So yeah, I still had a lot of unfinished business. The timing of the sale was quite inconvenient for me in terms of the team that I was managing and the work that we were trying to complete. So yeah, I was more than happy to stick around. We had, as shareholders, we had 2 years of earnout, which we ultimately achieved, but I was there for about a year, and then the next opportunity sort of slapped me in the face when Rod, turned the key on Xero and asked me, I guess, if I would be interested in both investing because he needed to raise some money ahead of the IPO to fund what was a pretty quickly growing team at that point. And
how big was Xero then?
It was when I joined. It was actually not that much smaller than TradeMe was, which is kind of trippy, really, because it was so much earlier in its journey. But it was a very different team. Like also, there's a lot of very experienced people in the early Xero team.
Well, Rod had done, Rod Drew had done well, previously had some very good experience under his belt, didn't he?
Yeah, so his previous business was called Aftermail. So I think there were 4 founders in that, and they sold that business for about $14 million just before the TradeMe sale. Yeah. And yeah, I think he thought that was a pretty good result. It was a great result, to be clear. Yeah. And then it sort of got trumped by TradeMe pretty soon after that. So yeah, I mean, thankfully, because it encouraged him to go again and try and do something even bigger and better.
And so, walk us through your involvement there, and
so
even I guess the investment side as well as being involved in the business,
Yeah, so I mean, my role was head of product strategy. I think was the official job title. It was a pretty wide ranging brief. I kind of had to work it out for myself what that actually meant. But yeah, I ended up working closely with the product teams and trying to just, I guess, inject some of the things that we'd learned in TradeMe, especially around measurability and kind of those pieces into that way of working for that team. From an investment side, it was a pretty precarious time. Everyone remembers now Xero to be this like glorious success, but in those days, like we were lucky to get the IPO away. We raised $15 million. The whole company was valued at $55 million. Today it's 28 billion Australian dollars or something like that. So the difference between then and now is almost unrecognizable.
Yeah, because the shares sort of launched at what, $1 or something.
We floated at $1. I think it closed on the first day at something like $1.10, and then it was pretty quickly underwater after that. And I think the lowest it got was like 67 cents. So there was a long period of time where those who had invested in the IPO had effectively lost money, on paper at least. So yeah, the idea that Xero was just this runaway success from the beginning is factually incorrect.
And what are the things that stick with you in terms of the lessons and learning?
So I think one of the big lessons out of Xero is what I just sort of touched on, like that idea that I kind of had taken for granted, I guess, up until that point, that facts trump opinions. That was very much our mindset at TradeMe. We were drowning in data. We had such a big user base and a huge marketplace of information. As long as we were collecting that and paying attention to that, often where we had questions or uncertainty, we could kind of fall back on what was actually happening. And Xero was completely different because Xero had none of that. Xero is much more of a faith-based belief in the future potential. And so, yeah, I sort of quickly realized that one of the things I could add was kind of just constantly pulling people back to say, well, what do we actually know? What do we know is true? And how can we use that knowledge to help us make better decisions that might actually get us to where we want to go, these big dreams we have are going to take a lot of little steps along the way. So
what would be an example there?
So bank feeds is a good example. During the IPO, we were using bank feeds as the killer feature of Xero. In some ways, it still is the killer feature of Xero, the way that software integrates automatically. People who have never experienced anything other than Xero probably forget the pain of manually reconciling all that stuff previously. So, we were telling a big story around bank feeds, how that was going to be the killer feature and how it was going to, create a very sticky product. Telling that story to investors. And one of the first things I realized when I joined that team was that there was a gap between that story and what we actually saw, which is, there weren't that many banks for a start that supported bank feeds. And even those that did, we hadn't done a great job of convincing people to go through the steps that were required at that stage to actually set that up. So just sort of exposing that and being a little bit more honest about that then led straight away to a conversation around, well, how can we do that better? And that's again the key that unlocks, so.
Yeah, well, I mean, in my recollection, my business was using MYOB, which was the predominant
Everybody
product
was,
at the time,
Yep.
and at some point in time, we made what at that stage had, by the time we made it was an inevitable change. It was like, well, this is the product, and
I mean,
and
the success of Xero really relied on a lot of people making the slightly irrational decision to make that change before the product was, probably as fully baked as it could have been. So, that's what creates that precariousness in the early stage of a venture. And there is a gap between what you're promising and what you've built, and all the more reason why you have to really pay attention to what's actually true, because it's very easy to get carried away with the story that you tell over and over and forget to actually ask whether it's true. And so, go back to the 3 ways to be wrong. That's the first way. It's like to just not ask the question.
Yeah, I certainly remember the bank feeds being a huge win right from the get go. So it's good. And from there, how did things?
So I mean, the
next
next challenge for me was really becoming an investor. Like, Xero was my first investment, really, post Trade Me, but it came bundled with a job, so it was kind of a very easy investment. And the next few after that were not so easy. And there was a period of time where I went back to being a beginner again and sort of had to learn some of the hard lessons about how to be an investor. And so that's the whole second part of this book, Paul, is kind of the sometimes painful but ultimately very rewarding experience that I went through. I guess the first investment that I made that actually kind of worked in that new way was Vend. And so I tell the stories of how that investment came about. It would be easy to kind of pretend that there's like a nice crisp 30-second version of that, but there's not. It takes a few chapters, and I guess that's maybe one of the takeaways thinking about Vend and Timely and a lot of these other companies that I've worked on since is they're messy and they're complicated, and how you behave as an investor, how founders work with investors, there's a lot of nuance to that, and a lot of the stories we tell create a mythology around that, which is actually quite misleading for people who are thinking about doing it themselves, trying to work on their own things. So one of the delights, I think, in writing this book is being able to tell the stories of what actually happened in these companies. Not only Trade Me and Xero, those are much higher profile companies, and there's also mythology in those, but especially these other companies that a lot of people aspire to replicate for themselves. I hope it's really useful to people to really understand how convoluted those successes ultimately were. And as someone who was working on them on the ground day to day, they never really felt like successes at all until quite late in the piece.
Just as a pretty key insight in itself to take away, right?
Right. And this is exactly why I wanted to start the book with those 4 near-death moments, because those stories just get airbrushed out so often. And there's a good reason for that, I think. Like people, when journalists or podcasters ask founders to tell the story, what you really want is a crisp soundbite, something that will go well on Instagram. And the reality is never crisp. It's always complicated, and it's often not flattering. So like there's sort of an incentive not to tell a story that's going to, make you look not great. And so I guess that's a privilege I have now, now that I can look back on these stories and I kind of know how they ended, is I don't have to pretend anymore.
Yeah, and I think it is so important to sort of delve into the tough stuff because, we kind of hear the big headlines, this company won this way or that company got disrupted because of X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
But packaged up into something that's very small, short, and simple. And
it's
look,
also
life
really
isn't like that.
No,
Business isn't like that.
It's really tempting to always look for the silver bullet too. Like, what's the one thing that we can copy and be guaranteed success as a result? And I mean, now having seen enough of these, like when you work on the second one, you realize there's some patterns in common, or at least you realize the differences between them. When you work on the third one, it's like, oh, actually there's some really recurring lessons here.
Yeah.
And fourth, fifth, sixth, so on. Like it just builds. And I think that ultimately where you land on that, once you've seen enough of them, is that they're all different. Like there's very little that's common across all of them. And I've tried to write about those things that are kind of the universal truths.
Yeah.
That comes back to advice for founders, and maybe we can talk about that. But the other thing to realize is that they each had their own unique reasons why they were successful. So trying to extract the silver bullet that we can use elsewhere is actually a fool's game. Like what you need to do is find the thing that's uniquely going to make the venture that you're working on successful, and that requires you to think. It requires you to experiment. And we don't tell those stories well. We don't give that advice well.
Yeah, and look, I think this is the value of the longer form content, the book, long podcasts and so on, that, and some of these things you can drill in a bit more.
Yeah.
But you need to go in with that open mind that there isn't going to be a super simple playbook. There are lessons that you can learn from these scenarios.
There's definitely meta things that are like universal truths. And so, it's a long time ago that we were working on these businesses now. The beginning of Vend was 2010. Timely, I invested in 2012, I think. So, there's now decade has passed more, but there are things that are still applicable. That's still advice that I give to founders even today. So maybe I'll run through a couple of those with you if you like.
Let's jump into them.
So, and I think about it in different layers. So at the first layer is really what you're building. We touched on this a little bit before, like, start with the customer and work backwards. I think anybody who's describing what they're working on as a technology company in 2025 needs to think a bit crisper, I think, about where they fit, because, now every company should be a tech company. If you have engineers on your payroll, that's good, but it's probably not remarkable. If you don't have engineers on your payroll, that's a problem. If you're outsourcing that piece to somebody else, it's probably not going to end well for you. So you don't define yourself as a technology company would be my first piece of advice to founders. And I think that's universally true. Like Timely is probably the strongest example of this, actually. Like we realized at Timely that we weren't a tech company, we were a health and beauty business, which sounds a bit strange for a guy with my haircut to say maybe, but we needed to really go deep on that sector and understand those customers and the problems they had in order to be successful. So that's the first one. The second one, more of a company level piece of advice, and that's the best founders choose their investors. So this is uncommon advice, I think. I think it's way more common. Many founders fall for the mythology that there's a desperate shortage of capital, and as a result, they need to beg for it. And I think that's really dangerous. I think what that reflects maybe is how we've allowed investors to put themselves at the center of the startup universe. And really founders should be at the center of the startup universe. They're the ones who really, make these ventures great. And when I say founders, I don't just mean the mythical lone geniuses. I mean the team of people working on these businesses.
It's a great point. And actually, for those that haven't heard it, there was one of our New Zealand business podcast episodes with Chris Heslip of PushPay, and he walked through the scenario they got to where they didn't let the investor kind of rule. They just about lost the entire
and I mean this is
shebang. But you have to make these.
This
calls
is why I say choose your investors. Like it's the people that you choose to partner with on the financial side of the business. It's an important choice. It's like a puppy for Christmas. You have them for a long time. And like you can choose somebody who can really help you. I think that's the key, because if you find someone who can really help you, then the next question is, what do I need to do to convince them to invest? And, this comes back to our discussion around valuation and all those other things. Those are all variables that you can use to attract the sort of investor who can push you forward through the next phase of the business. So yeah, that's again a universal truth, I think, that applies even today to people who are working on companies. And then the last one I would say is more like an ecosystem level piece of advice, which is focus on your own company first. There's a lot of noise in the ecosystem. There's a lot of people who like the ideas of startups and, like organizing events or, business plan competitions, or even at the funding layer, there's lots of grants and loan schemes and all sorts of other things that you can spend your time getting sucked into. But most of that is noise. Very little of that is signal. I think, the common pattern across all of these companies is the people who were working on these companies and made them successful were hyper-focused on their company and not getting too distracted all the time by all of that noise in the ecosystem. And it's a put your own mask on first scenario here. My personal experience of this is I'm able to contribute much more to the ecosystem having had success. If enough of us create one great company, then we have a great ecosystem. It's just a collective noun. So yeah, there's kind of, there's universal truths at all layers of this stuff, Paul.
Yep.
And a lot of that advice is, even when you hear it, it's still quite hard to follow because it's not the common kind of way of thinking about them.
And look, I think you've shared sort of some commentary in the past around, things within the startup ecosystem in New Zealand that from your viewpoint aren't necessarily helpful. Being in a co-working space or, varying things like that. Sort of, I'm keen to sort of hear your, a little bit of, take on some of these things. I guess different people are going to come from different perspectives. They'll have different experiences on why something might help them or might not help another. But, what have you seen on some of those things that you think actually, maybe we do need to rethink some of our views on?
I think, it's very easy to be a critic, right? So I need to be always careful of that. And hopefully that's not what I've done over the years. I know it might be in some people's minds, the reputation that, I'm just universally critical, but really it comes back to the same question that I asked when I joined the team at Xero, which is just, is it working? And if so, how do we know? And it's amazing what those two simple questions can lead you to if you consciously ask them. Think back. The first way to be wrong is to not even ask the question. The second way to be wrong is to make a mistake, which is more excusable. The third way is to lie. And I think if I look across the ecosystem, we see all three of those mistakes. We have historically been very reluctant to ask, to genuinely inquire whether the things that we've tried work. You'll often hear people who are most enthusiastic about that saying, well, we won't know for 10 years or 20 years whether this is successful. And ironically, those are the same people who say, 12 weeks to get to demo day and fail fast. But when you apply that thinking to their own thing, they get quite uncomfortable. And I think we would have been better off, and we will be better off in the future if we can just do that one thing. Just start with an assumption that it might not work and constantly test ourselves. So how do we know this is working? Because then that gives you a chance to iterate, to learn from your mistakes and to improve. Whereas if you just stick doggedly to your assumption that it's going to work, which is what we've done for a generation, then it doesn't end up in a good place often, or it's a roll of the dice. And yeah, I think that the third way to be wrong in some situations is also a criticism. Once you know that something's not working, it's better to admit that and to correct for that than to kind of just hope that nobody notices and to plow on. It's painful because it forces you to admit that you were mistaken.
Of course, but we all make mistakes.
We
right?
all make
and
mistakes.
You try and make the best decisions.
Yeah, and I think the key to that is making small mistakes, right? Because when you make a big mistake, it's really painful, and I've done that a few times myself, and it sucks. But yeah, just continuing to say, we thought this was true 10 years ago. All the evidence points the opposite, but let's come up with a reason to keep doing it. I don't think that helps us.
Yeah, good call. Now, looking at New Zealand, I think most of us want New Zealand to do better on the global stage, for us to build, bigger, better, more startups, more tech companies, for want of a better word.
Yeah.
More startups that become successful over time. What do you think that we kind of get right on that front versus the areas that
I mean, ultimately that's why I wrote this book. One of the things these 4 companies that I've had the opportunity to work on prove is that we can do it here. It's delightful to be able to tell a New Zealand story like this.
Yes.
The books that I read when I was working on these, at the beginning of these things, were all about American successes. They're all Silicon Valley companies. And we learned a lot from that. Some of the patterns were applicable and some of them were completely not applicable. But these stories are all New Zealand stories. And so they prove we can do it here. And so then the question is just, well, we should have done it more. Why haven't we done it more? And again, this is a question I ask founders all the time in the context of a specific company. It's what's our constraint? Why aren't we growing faster? Why don't we have more sales? Why don't we have more delighted customers? Those are all good questions which unlock, what's actually holding us back. And for me, at least, when you ask that question about New Zealand, a lot of it just comes back to people. There's just not that many of us. We keep calling ourselves a small country. We're actually not a small country. We're an enormous country on a per square kilometre basis. It's just not that many of us. And so we need to think much more clearly, I think, about how we unlock that constraint for these companies. Because when you get beyond that sort of mythical capital constraint, like the people who actually successfully raise capital very quickly run into the brick wall of trying to spend it. Because a lot of these companies, the predominant thing that they spend that capital on is people. And those people are expensive.
Of course.
And there's just not that many of them. And so, in some perverse cases, we end up kind of poaching people from other startups in our ecosystem. That's a sign of failure, really. It's an indicator that the constraint that we have is kind of holding us back. So, and there's again, sadly, no silver bullet answer to that. There's 1,000 little things that might collectively unlock that, but we need to do all of them.
Yeah, and that's, I guess, part of what makes it quite a challenge, and part of the importance.
It's a huge challenge, but also an opportunity, right? I hope the people who read this, and maybe they'll pass it on to others they know once they have. Hopefully, that inspires more people to work on and invest in these companies, because that, very simply, is our biggest constraint.
Yeah.
So if you're currently working on an accelerator program or in a government department trying to support startups, think about how you work on a startup. That will be more consequential. If you're currently investing in things that are non-productive, think about how you invest in a startup, because that will be more consequential. And that, there's lots of ways to do that now. It's maybe through a fund, or maybe you want to invest directly if you're brave. But the more people who do those simple things, the better the ecosystem will be.
Yeah, because these days you can invest through a KiwiSaver or something like Punakaiki Fund, or as you say, you can invest directly. So there's mechanisms where everyone can be
right. And at a policy
involved.
level, I think that's a great example. We've been very timid as a country on compulsory superannuation, for example, and that question gets quite political. But then just look across the Tasman. We in the startup ecosystem, we often look across there and we're quite envious, because they have a very strong layer of venture capital funds. And thankfully, most of those funds are quite happy to invest in New Zealand too, so we benefit. But if you kind of follow the chain, the investors in those Australian venture funds are their massive superannuation funds. So through their equivalent of KiwiSaver, Australians are investing in funds that are investing in New Zealand tech startups. So just follow the chain. When Vend exited, one of our biggest shareholders was SquarePeg, which is a Australian venture fund.
Yes.
So, Australian savers benefited from that. And really, it would have been better if more New Zealand savers had benefited from that in terms of our economic outcomes.
Of course, yeah.
And so, there's a lot of policy levers that we could pull there too, which would have a big impact, I think.
Do you have some particular ones in mind?
Yeah, and I'm sort of reluctant to labour them because they're not easy things to fix. Many of the most impactful things are the ones that are most ingrained for us. We still have a mindset in New Zealand that the way we get rich is by owning property, buying little bits of the country off each other.
And interesting, I had Sir John Key in yesterday, and that was actually part of the chat.
How do you unlock that? I mean, we've talked about superannuation. I mean, another one maybe at the other end of the political spectrum, because a lot of these questions do get political, sadly, rather than when the question really should be what works. But at the other end, like often in business in New Zealand, we have this kind of mindset that the government should underwrite the risk. We look to organisations like Callaghan Innovation, which has just been shut down as we record this, to provide grants and loans and subsidies at the early stages of businesses without any upside. When those businesses go on to be successful, the value is captured by individuals rather than collectively by the people who have provided those underwrites in the beginning. So that's not great either. Like, if you're going to be taking the risk on an early stage business, you should be getting the upside. So that breaking that mindset of kind of expecting someone else to take the risk, but assuming that you can capture the rewards.
Yeah, look, I don't think you're that's a particularly obscure viewpoint, but
how do you make that change as a
yeah.
And this is why I'll never be a politician, Paul, because I guess that then becomes how do you compromise in order to achieve those outcomes, and I'm just not very good at that. So
yes, look, I think the political world is such a unique beast, and as you say, compromise, and that's sort of such a key part of how it works. And
I wish the politicians luck.
So, in terms of what you would see as the audience for the book, who would you expect is going to be reading How to Be Wrong, and who is it going to? Because it doesn't just have to help them individually; it can be the lessons that get passed on to others, and we all sort of pass around and share books and share stories,
and I hope that happens with this too,
and so on. So where do you see it ending up?
I mean, we've just been talking about some questions which are pretty broad. They're not specific to technology. They're not really even specific to startups. They're kind of the questions of prosperity, and this all goes back to some of the things that Paul Callaghan himself was saying. I was actually lucky enough to be in the room when he gave that lecture in 2011, and he was right. Like, a lot of the things that he said, which we still repeat today, were very insightful, predictions about what would help. Broadly speaking, we haven't really done what he prescribed, so there's a lesson in that. If you stop and think about it. But I think the audience for this is broad, because I think the more generally people think about these topics, about how these kinds of businesses actually help us all, the better for all of us. And then there's a smaller audience of people that we were just talking about too, the ones who should really be working on and investing in these companies, but maybe aren't yet. And maybe I can find an audience of people who are curious about that, who hopefully will be informed and entertained by the real stories, not the mythology or the soundbite versions of what you hear. And then I guess the people I care about the most, my people, are the people who are currently working on and investing in companies, and that's a growing group. Like, I'm very optimistic, despite the reputation, about where we sit in the ecosystem. It's never been better, and the reason for that is there's lots of people now who have had the experience of working on some of these companies that I was, part of in the beginning, who are spinning out to their next venture. And when you see that, when you see that experience recycling, you see that capital recycling, that's what builds an ecosystem. And so, to all those people, I hope they'll buy the book and read it and be encouraged to keep going, because we need them to focus on their company and make it great.
Yeah. Well, thank you for writing it. I think we need more of this, and of course, not everyone is a writer and is able to put their thoughts and their experiences down. I only just got my hand on the preview of it yesterday, so I haven't read it from cover to cover as it were just yet. But what I've read so far was really engaging and really interesting, and I think it will be of interest to a wide variety of people. So really anyone that's listening to this, I'd be saying, hey, go out and have a read. And look, we will all take different things away depending on where you sit within the broader sort of tech innovation startup kind of ecosystem here in New Zealand. But it's also good to be hearing from other people, right? And we chatted about this before the show, Rowan, around we'll often be focused on the founder or the chief executive and so on,
right.
and often it's that those are the people more willing to talk and to come on a podcast,
of course.
But I always find it really interesting when we're chatting to folks that maybe haven't been so much in the spotlight or the figurehead, because the successes that come are not just from one person. They're from a whole combination of people that have worked really hard, that have brought their creativity, their thinking, to the table. Yeah. And so the viewpoints and experiences that you share will be different to what we would hear from, say, a Rod Jury chat or, etc. So yeah, I think, really helpful. I think some really good insights. There'll be disagreement, I'm sure, on some of the some of the takes, but
it is called How to Be Wrong.
Stuff,
so
right?
No, I mean, that's delightful to hear. Thank you. I hope that's true. And I think if nothing else, next time if you read the book, next time someone tells you, did you know Sam Morgan built Trade Me in his bedroom, or did you know Rod Jury started Xero, you can say, oh well, actually. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. Yeah. I mean, I often experience this where people are surprised to hear I worked on any one of these companies, let alone all of them. And the reason for that is my name's not attached to any of those companies. But I'm the rule, not the exception. There are hundreds of people who have worked on these companies and contributed, consequential, in some cases, load-bearing things to those companies, And most of us don't know their names. And one of the real delights in writing this book is to be able to shine a little spotlight on a few of those folks. But be aware, I've named a tiny little fraction of them. The book would be far too long if I tried to be thorough about that. But that's a pattern that repeats across every single one of these successful companies. So,
yeah, great. And what date is the book launching, and what forms is it going to be available in?
Yep. So it's launch week is the last week of February. I'm working hard to make sure that we've got physical copies of everything. Making a physical thing is quite a new experience for me, Paul. So, and there will be an ebook and an audiobook version eventually. We'll hustle to get those available as soon as we can after that launch. But people can buy it right away. It's available for pre-sale on howtobewrongbook.com. Buy it directly, and we'll get it to you as soon as we have physical copies to send.
That's really cool. Well, thank you for joining the show, Rowan Simpson. We're really looking forward to learning a little bit more about how to be wrong and therefore how to be right. That's great. Well, thank you very much. And, of course, thanks everyone for listening in. Big thank you to our show partners, Gorilla Technology, HP, 2 Degrees Spark, and 1NZ. And, of course, for those that have been listening in to the audio, do make sure you're following us on video channels as well if you like to consume video. A reasonable chunk of our episodes are available live or in some video form. So you'll find those across the likes of YouTube and X and on our NZ Tech Podcast channels. Also through following me on LinkedIn, where we tend to do some of the live streams. But thanks again, Ron. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. That was a fun conversation. Good questions.
Thank you. Cheers.
The New Zealand Tech Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, proactive and strategic IT.